February 24th, 1968. While American newspapers declared victory after the Tet Offensive, inside a hidden bunker near the Cambodian border, Vietnamese General Tran Van Tra stared at casualty reports that revealed a truth no one expected. 45,000 of his soldiers were dead, 0 cities remained captured, and the revolution they had promised never happened. But what did Vietnamese High Command actually say to each other when they realized their greatest offensive had failed? And how did this catastrophic military defeat somehow win them the war 7 years later? February 24th, 1968. Tay Ninh Province, South Vietnam. Deep underground in a bunker complex hidden beneath triple canopy jungle near the Cambodian border, General Tran Van Tra sat at a wooden table covered with maps and read the words that confirmed his worst fears. The Tet Offensive was lost. Not the way politicians in Hanoi would admit it, and not the way American newspapers were starting to suggest their side was losing, but truly lost in the way that matters to soldiers who count bodies and measure ground. 45,000 communist fighters were dead, not wounded, not missing. Dead. And for all those deaths, they held exactly 0 cities. The bunker smelled like wet earth and cigarette smoke. Tra could hear the distant thump of American artillery, a sound that had become as common as breathing after 3 weeks of fighting. Water dripped from the ceiling where tree roots pushed through the packed dirt. The air was thick and hot, even underground, heavy with the kind of humidity that made uniforms stick to skin and paper curl at the edges. Soviet-supplied radios crackled with coded messages from across South Vietnam, each transmission bringing more bad news. Tra was the deputy commander of COSVN, the Central Office for South Vietnam. He was the man who turned orders from Hanoi into action on the ground. He knew every unit, every commander, every plan. For months they had prepared for this moment. 84,000 troops had moved into position, hiding in plain sight during the Tet holiday ceasefire. The plan was brilliant. Attack everywhere at once. Overwhelm the Americans and the South Vietnamese army. Show the people that their government could not protect them. Watch the South Vietnamese soldiers throw down their weapons and join the revolution. Force America to negotiate from weakness. It had been 3 weeks since the offensive began on January 30th. 3 weeks of the most intense fighting of the entire war. And now, Tra sat with papers that told the true story, the one that would never appear in propaganda broadcasts or victory speeches. The numbers were brutal and clear. In Saigon, 19 special soldiers had attacked the American embassy itself. The world watched on television as they blew a hole in the wall and stormed inside. It was supposed to be the signal that nowhere was safe, that American power was an illusion. All 19 attackers died within 6 hours. Not one escaped. The embassy was back in American hands before most people in Washington finished breakfast. In Hue, the old imperial city, 7,500 fighters had captured the ancient citadel. They raised their flag over the walls and executed anyone they suspected of working with the government. For 26 days, they held the city against everything America threw at them. Jets screamed overhead, dropping bombs. Tanks rolled through streets firing shells into buildings. Marines fought house by house, room by room. When it ended, 5,000 communist soldiers lay dead in Hue. The city was destroyed, but back in government hands. At Khe Sanh, the mountain base near the border, they had surrounded 6,000 Marines and pounded them with artillery for weeks. The plan was simple: make America so worried about Khe Sanh that they would pull troops away from the cities. Then the cities would fall easily. But the Marines never broke, the base never fell, and American forces never left the cities undefended. Across South Vietnam, the story repeated. Ben Tre, Bien Hoa, Can Tho, Mai Tho. Over 100 cities and towns attacked simultaneously. Some fell for hours, some for days. But every single one was eventually retaken. And the people, the ordinary Vietnamese who were supposed to rise up and join the revolution, mostly stayed inside and waited for the fighting to end. Tra looked at the map with its red markers showing where attacks had happened. So many red marks. Each one had been carefully planned. Each one represented months of preparation, stockpiled weapons, brave fighters willing to die. And each one was now a failure measured in bodies and broken dreams. The worst number sat at the bottom of the latest casualty report, 80%. That was how many local Vietnamese communist leaders had been killed or captured in the South. For years they had hidden among the people, organizing in secret, building the revolution from below. The offensive had forced them into the open, made them reveal themselves to attack the cities. Now, they were gone, dead or in prison camps. The entire network of Southern revolutionaries that had taken a decade to build was destroyed in 3 weeks. A messenger entered the bunker and handed Tra another report. This one was from intelligence officers who monitored American radio broadcasts. The report included a quote from an American general named Westmoreland. He called the Tet Offensive the greatest defeat of the war. He said the Vietnamese communists would never recover. He was talking about victory parades and turning points. Tra put down the paper and lit another cigarette. The radio crackled again. This time it was a coded message from Hanoi, from Le Duan himself, the first secretary who had pushed for this offensive over the objections of more cautious commanders. Le Duan wanted a report. He wanted to know when they would resume the attacks. He wanted to know when the people would rise up. He wanted victory. Tra looked around the bunker at the other commanders, young men mostly, dedicated revolutionaries who believed in the cause. They had followed orders and sent their soldiers to attack fortified positions with light weapons. They had promised those soldiers that the people would join them, that the enemy would collapse. Now those soldiers were dead, and nothing had changed except that America was more angry, and the South Vietnamese government was still standing. Outside, the jungle pressed close around the bunker. Insects buzzed in the heat. Somewhere, a monkey screamed. The war continued. But something fundamental had shifted. The question now was not how to explain the victory they had promised. The question was how to explain that 45,000 men had died for nothing, that the revolution had been set back years, and that from this moment forward, everything would be different. How do you tell your leaders that you lost when they need to hear that you won? The plan had seemed perfect on paper. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the man who defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu, had spent years developing the strategy. He called it protracted warfare. Wear down the enemy slowly, avoid big battles, strike and fade, let time be the weapon. But Le Duan, the first secretary in Hanoi, had grown impatient. He wanted a knockout blow. He wanted to force America to quit. So he changed the plan. The new strategy called for 84,000 troops to attack at once. Another 35,000 waited in reserve. They spent 3 months moving fighters into position, smuggling weapons into cities hidden in vegetable carts and coffins, storing ammunition in houses and temples. They used the Tet holiday, the Vietnamese New Year, when everyone expected a ceasefire. The timing was clever, the execution was detailed, the coordination was impressive. Every unit knew its target, every commander understood the goal. The goal was simple: make the South Vietnamese army collapse. Show the people their government could not protect them, prove that nowhere was safe, force ordinary Vietnamese to choose sides and assume they would choose the revolution. Then America, seeing its ally crumble, would negotiate peace from a position of weakness. The war would end with communist victory, but the goal required something that never happened. It required the South Vietnamese army to break and run. It required police and government officials to surrender. It required students and workers and farmers to pour into the streets with weapons and join the fight. None of that occurred. In Saigon, the capital city, the plan focused on symbolic targets: the American embassy, the presidential palace, the radio station, the airport. Small teams of fighters were supposed to seize these places and hold them while the people rallied. The 19 men who attacked the embassy were elite sappers, the best of the best. They blew a hole in the wall at 3 in the morning. They got inside the compound. American military police killed them all by 9 in the morning, 6 hours from start to finish. The most important attack of the entire offensive lasted less time than a work shift. At Hue, the ancient capital, 7,500 fighters did manage to take and hold the city. For 26 days they controlled the citadel, the old fortress with walls 10 meters high and 6 meters thick. They thought if they could hold one major city, it would inspire others. Instead, American and South Vietnamese forces brought in tanks, jets, and artillery. They fired over 100,000 artillery shells into the city. Jets dropped 500 bombs. Marines fought building by building. When it ended, 5,000 communist fighters were dead. Hue was rubble. The bodies were so numerous that bulldozers pushed them into mass graves. The mathematics of failure were brutal. In every engagement, communist forces died at rates that made victory impossible. For every American killed, 17 communist fighters died. In some battles, it was worse, 20-1, 25-1. Light weapons against helicopters, AK-47 rifles against M16s, machine guns, grenades, artillery, napalm, and bombs. Courage could not overcome firepower. Surprise could not defeat resources. Tran knew these numbers because he read every casualty report. He knew that the 271st Regiment lost 95% of its soldiers attacking Saigon. He knew the 6th Regiment bled away 70% of its force in the 26 days at Hue. He knew that local Vietnamese communist units, the village and district-level fighters who formed the backbone of the Southern Revolution, had been destroyed. They came out of hiding to attack, and American and South Vietnamese forces killed them or captured them. The secret networks that took 10 years to build were gone in 3 weeks. The worst part was not the numbers. The worst part was what the numbers meant. Before Tet, the Vietnamese communists in the South were a real fighting force. They could control territory. They could tax villages. They could recruit new fighters from the local population. After Tet, they were broken. From now on, the war would be fought by North Vietnamese Army regulars coming down from the north. The Southern Revolution, the idea that the people of South Vietnam were rising up against their government, was revealed as mostly fiction. Tra had tried to warn them. So had other field commanders. They said the people were not ready to revolt. They said the South Vietnamese army was stronger than Hanoi believed. They said the Americans would react with overwhelming force. But Le Duan insisted. He said the time was right. He said the balance of forces favored the revolution. He said one great blow would crack the enemy. In the bunker, Tra received another radio message. This one was from a commander near Saigon. His unit had started with 400 men. He had 68 left. He was asking permission to withdraw. Tra gave it. What else could he do? Send them to die for nothing? The irony burned like acid. American commanders were calling Tet a great victory. They were right in every way that could be measured on a battlefield. Body count. Decisive American advantage. Territory held. All objectives recaptured. Enemy capability. Severely degraded. By every military standard, the Vietnamese communists had suffered a crushing defeat. The kind of defeat that ends wars. But something strange was happening in America. Tra had read the intelligence reports. American newspapers were showing photographs of the embassy attack. Television was broadcasting footage of street fighting in Saigon. Reporters were questioning whether the war could be won. An important newsman named Walter Cronkite was telling millions of Americans that the war seemed to be a stalemate. The American president, Johnson, looked tired and defensive in his speeches. Tra understood something that the Americans did not seem to grasp. Wars are not won just on battlefields. They are won in the minds of people far from the fighting. If Americans believed the war was hopeless, then eventually they would demand their government stop fighting. It did not matter how many battles they won. It mattered what their people believed about those battles. But this understanding brought no comfort. 45,000 fighters were still dead. The Southern Revolutionary Movement was still shattered. The war would still continue for years, and Tra would have to face Le Duan on the radio and explain why the promised victory had turned into disaster. He would have to find words that acknowledge failure without calling it failure. He would have to admit that they had not correctly understood the balance of forces, that the enemy did not collapse as predicted, that the people did not rise up to join them. These were hard truths to speak to men who needed to hear about triumph. The bunker suddenly felt very small. The maps on the wall showed a country covered in red attack markers, but red markers were not the same as red flags flying over liberated cities. Plans were not the same as victory, and wanting something desperately did not make it true. The emergency meeting began at 8 in the morning on February 24th. Tra sat at the wooden table with 5 other commanders. Each man represented a different front, a different sector of the war. Each brought his own casualty reports and his own list of failures. The air in the bunker was thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken fear. No one wanted to be the first to say the words out loud. No one wanted to admit what they all knew. At noon, the radio crackled to life. The voice on the other end belonged to Le Duan in Hanoi. The connection was poor, full of static, but the words came through clearly enough. Le Duan wanted a status report. He wanted to know when the next wave of attacks would begin. He wanted to hear that the Americans were reeling and close to breaking. He wanted good news. Tra looked at the other commanders. Their faces said everything. There would be no next wave. There were no reserves left to commit. The fighters who survived the first attacks were exhausted, scattered, or trapped. Many units existed only on paper now. Their soldiers were dead, or had deserted, or were hiding in the jungle waiting for orders that would never come. Tra picked up the radio handset. His hand was steady, but his throat felt tight. He chose his words carefully. He said that the offensive had achieved important goals. The enemy had been surprised. Attacks had occurred across the entire country. The world had seen that the revolution was strong. These things were true as far as they went, but they were not the full truth. Le Duan interrupted. He asked about the cities. He asked about the uprising. He asked when the South Vietnamese army would collapse. These were the questions that mattered. These were the measures of success or failure. Tra took a breath. He said that they had not correctly assessed the balance of forces. He said the enemy did not collapse as predicted. He said the local population did not rise up to join the fighting. He said these things in a flat voice, letting the facts speak for themselves. He did not say the word defeat. He did not say the word failure. But everyone listening understood. There was a long silence on the radio. In that silence, Tra could imagine Le Duan in Hanoi, sitting in his office, realizing that the great gamble had failed. The offensive that was supposed to end the war had instead destroyed the Southern Revolutionary Movement. The VC, the Vietnamese communists who lived and fought in South Vietnam, were finished as an effective force. From now on, the war would have to be fought by North Vietnamese army regulars. The fiction that this was a Southern uprising against a corrupt government was exposed as a lie. Finally, Le Duan spoke again. His voice was different now, harder. He said to consolidate and preserve remaining forces. He said to avoid unnecessary battles. He said to rebuild slowly and carefully. These orders came from General Giap, he explained. Giap, who had opposed the timing of the offensive, who had wanted to wait longer, was now picking up the pieces. The message was clear. The bold strategy had failed. Now they would return to the slow, grinding war of patience that Giap had always favored. Tra put down the radio handset. Around the table, the other commanders sat in silence. Each man was thinking about the soldiers he had sent to their deaths. Each man was calculating how many years it would take to rebuild what had been lost in 3 weeks. Each man knew that this moment would be remembered, but not the way they had hoped. The human cost sat heavy in the room, like a physical weight. Tra thought about specific units, specific commanders. The 271st Regiment that attacked Saigon had started with over 800 men. Fewer than 50 survived. These were not just numbers. These were boys from villages in the north who had walked hundreds of miles down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, carrying weapons and rice. These were dedicated revolutionaries who believed they were fighting for freedom. They died in street battles they could not win, attacking positions they could not hold, waiting for support from civilians who never came. At Hue, the 6th Regiment had fought for 26 days straight. They held the citadel against tanks and jets and artillery. They died in the rubble of ancient buildings, buried under walls that had stood for centuries. The Marines who fought them later said the Vietnamese communists were brave. They said the enemy never quit, never surrendered, fought to the last man in many cases. But bravery without victory is just tragedy. Intelligence reports later revealed what the other side was thinking. American commanders called Tet the enemy's Gettysburg, a reference to a famous battle in American history where one side attacked boldly and lost badly. General Westmoreland said the VC would never recover. He was right. MACV, the American Military Command, estimated that 70 to 80% of the VC infrastructure in the South had been exposed and destroyed. They were right too, but other intelligence told a different story. The CIA was reporting that American public opinion was shifting, protests were growing, important newspapers were questioning the war. The shock of seeing fighting in Saigon on television was more powerful than any number of victory announcements. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in American news, had returned from Vietnam and told his audience that the war seemed unwinnable. President Johnson watched that broadcast and reportedly said that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. This was the bitter paradox that Tran understood as he sat in the bunker. They had lost the battle decisively. Body counts did not lie. Territory captured and lost did not lie. Casualties that could never be replaced did not lie. By every military measure, the Tet Offensive was a disaster. It set back the communist cause by years. It destroyed the Southern Revolution. It exposed the myth that the people were ready to rise up. But something had shifted in America. The shock of the attacks, the images on television, the realization that after years of war the enemy could still strike anywhere, had changed how Americans viewed the war. Victory suddenly seemed further away, not closer. The end seemed more distant, not near. And in a democracy, public opinion eventually becomes policy. Tran gathered his papers and stood up. The meeting was over. Orders were clear. Preserve what remained. Avoid contact. Rebuild slowly. The war would continue, but differently now. The VC were broken. The NVA would have to carry the burden. The quick victory they had hoped for was impossible. Now it would be a long, slow, grinding war again, just as Giap had always said it must be. As Tran climbed the ladder out of the bunker, he could hear artillery in the distance. American B-52 bombers were hitting targets along the border. The jungle around him was scarred with bomb craters and defoliated patches where Agent Orange had killed all the vegetation. The war had turned the landscape into something brutal and broken. He wondered how many more years it would take. He wondered how many more would die. He wondered if the political victory in America would come soon enough to matter. But mostly he thought about the 45,000 who would never go home, who died believing they would spark a revolution, who trusted their leaders to choose the right moment. They had been wrong about the timing. They had been wrong about the people rising up. They had been wrong about so much. And now those soldiers were gone, and all that remained was to find a way forward through the wreckage. The months after Tet revealed the full scope of what had been lost and what had been gained. By March 1968, it became clear that the war had fundamentally changed. The VC units that had controlled villages and collected taxes and recruited fighters were mostly gone. The survivors hid in remote jungle areas or across the border in Cambodia. They were no longer a coherent fighting force. The North Vietnamese army had to send regular units south to fill the gaps. Young men from North Vietnam, wearing proper uniforms and carrying modern weapons, replaced the local guerrillas who had worn black pajamas and carried whatever guns they could find. The Americans noticed this change, and they exploited it ruthlessly. The Phoenix program, designed to identify and eliminate Vietnamese communist leadership, suddenly became much more effective. When the VC came out of hiding to attack during Tet, they revealed themselves. American and South Vietnamese intelligence officers compiled lists of names, addresses, and photos. In the months after Tet, thousands of VC organizers were captured or killed. The rate increased by 70% compared to the year before. The secret networks that connected villages to district headquarters to provincial commands were torn apart. General Giap, watching from Hanoi, was quietly pushed aside. He had opposed the timing of the offensive. He had warned that the forces were not ready, that the people would not rise up, that the costs would be too high. He had been right, but being right did not help him. Le Duan consolidated power and changed the strategy. From now on, the war would be fought as a conventional conflict. Large NVA units would move south and engage in bigger battles. The guerrilla war was over. The regular war was beginning. This shift had consequences that would echo for years. The NVA units were better trained and better equipped than the VC had been. They could fight set-piece battles with artillery support and coordinated attacks. But they were also more visible and easier to target. American firepower, which had struggled against an invisible enemy hiding among civilians, was devastating against conventional forces operating in the open. The years from 1969 to 1972 saw some of the highest communist casualty rates of the entire war. Yet, even as the military situation turned darker for the communists, the political situation in America turned in their favor. On March 31, 1968, just 5 weeks after Tran sat in his bunker reading casualty reports, President Johnson went on television and shocked the world. He announced he would not seek re-election. He announced a partial bombing halt. He called for peace negotiations. The shock of Tet, combined with growing protests and declining support, had broken his will to continue. The man who had sent 500,000 American soldiers to Vietnam was giving up. Tra heard this news and understood its meaning immediately. They had lost the battle, but won something more important. They had broken American confidence. The attacks had not defeated the American military. The casualty ratios proved that. But the attacks had shown the American people that their government had been lying to them. All the optimistic reports about progress, about the enemy being weak, about victory being near, were exposed as false. If the enemy was so weak, how did they attack over 100 cities simultaneously? If victory was so close, why was fighting still happening in the streets of Saigon? The negotiations that started in Paris later that year went nowhere for a long time, but the direction was set. America was looking for a way out. It would take 7 more years, 70,000 more American deaths, and hundreds of thousands more Vietnamese deaths. But the path forward was clear after Tet. America would eventually leave. The question was no longer if, but when and under what conditions. In 1982, long after the war ended, the Vietnamese Communist Party published an official history. In that history, they admitted certain truths that had been hidden during the war. They wrote that they did not base their Tet strategy on scientific calculation or careful weighing of factors. They wrote that they did not achieve their main objective. They called the offensive premature and too ambitious. These admissions came 14 years late, after the war was won, when honesty no longer mattered. General Tran Van Tra wrote his own memoir after the war. In it, he was more blunt. He wrote that, in all honesty, they did not achieve their goals. He wrote that the casualties were catastrophic, and the losses were nearly impossible to recover from. He described the years after Tet as a desperate struggle to rebuild, to survive, to maintain any kind of presence in the South. He wrote these things in the 1980s, after victory, when he could afford to be honest. The numbers tell their own story. The official estimate is that over 200,000 Vietnamese communists died between 1968 and 1975 after the Tet Offensive destroyed the VC infrastructure. The war that might have ended in some kind of negotiated settlement in 1968 dragged on for 7 more brutal years. The Easter Offensive in 1972 was a conventional invasion with tanks and artillery, nothing like the guerrilla tactics of earlier years. When the final offensive came in 1975, it was purely a conventional military operation. Tank columns rolled down highways towards Saigon. There was no popular uprising. There were no guerrillas in black pajamas. Just regular army soldiers in regular army uniforms conquering territory the old-fashioned way. The great irony of Tet is that both sides claimed victory, and both sides were right in different ways. The Americans won every military engagement. They killed the enemy at rates that made communist victory seem impossible. They recaptured every city. They destroyed the VC as a fighting force. By any military standard, they won decisively. But wars are not decided just by military standards. They are decided by politics and will and public opinion. The Americans won the battles, but lost the will to keep fighting. The Vietnamese communists lost the battles, but kept their will intact. The jungle around the Cos Vien bunker eventually reclaimed the land. The bomb craters filled with water and became ponds. Trees grew back where Agent Orange had killed everything. Farmers returned to fields that had been battlefields. They found shell casings and unexploded ordnance in the soil. The sounds of artillery faded and were replaced by the sounds of cicadas and birds and ordinary life. 45,000 fighters died in 3 weeks believing they would change history. In a way, they did. Just not the way they expected. Their deaths did not spark a revolution. Their sacrifices did not bring immediate victory. But their attacks broke something in America that never fully healed. The images of fighting in Saigon, the shock of attacks during a supposed ceasefire, the realization that years of war had not brought security, all combined to turn American opinion against the war. In that bunker on February 24, 1968, General Tra understood that he was witnessing a strange kind of victory wrapped inside a terrible defeat. The military disaster would eventually lead to political triumph, but only after 7 more years of death. Only after the entire nature of the war changed. only after every assumption and strategy was revised. Sometimes the most devastating defeat contains the seeds of ultimate victory. But those seeds take years to grow, and the gardeners who plant them rarely live to see the harvest.